About that.
A little bit. All righty. So I want to make sure that we set our intention. Our intention is to help our listeners understand and differentiate between narcissistic personality disorder, which is usually very toxic, I would say almost always, and narcissistic personality characteristics or tendencies or traits. Unpacking Mormonism is a subsidiary of Daisy Girl Communications, LLC. All content herein is intended for educational purposes only and does not replace the advice or counsel of your personal care provider. Is the prophet of the Mormon Church a narcissist? I think he might be. Welcome back to Unpacking Mormonism and Other Religious Trauma. I'm your host, Sarah Westbrook, joined by my husband and co-host, Mason Westbrook.
And I'm just excited and anxious about being here right now.
How come anxious?
I knew you were going to ask me that question, by the way. I think
What,
it's
how
simply,
come anxious?
Yeah. I expected that you would ask, well, why are you excited? Why are you anxious? I expected you to really go in and therapize me. So I was almost ready for this question.
What makes you anxious? No, I asked a curious question.
Yeah,
I think.
It was curious. It wasn't,
Okay.
I didn't feel anything but curiosity. I just knew you were going to ask.
Oh, you said, when
So
you
first-
said it, you said why, or I heard you say why. Why are you anxious or why are you this? And I'm like, did I say why? That's like a no as a therapist.
Right, I think you did.
What makes you anxious?
And there's evidence now on the recording.
What? So, y'all, I'm not perfect. If I used the word why instead of what, I will be more aware of that because that's not how I want to do it. So, Mason, what makes you anxious about today's episode?
First, let me say I'm excited because of the material. I'm excited because we're actually talking about something that people have asked for.
Several people. So
that's exciting that we're getting some feedback and able to address that feedback. That's exciting for us. I'm anxious just because I'm not exactly sure where I stand with the church in general. I'm still trying to be a part of it. The idea that you're going to ask and to delve into the question, is the prophet, the president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, a narcissist? Obviously, we're going to be talking about people that at least for a good part of my life, I've had a great amount of respect for, that a lot of people have a great amount of respect for, and that a lot of people have no respect for after their particular journey. But we're going to delve into that. And so I'm a little anxious about where that's going to put us, where we're going to go. But I'm still excited. I think that it's going to go well. I'm excited about the material. And I hope that you and I together and the listeners joining in can learn a great deal because, as you've said multiple times, kind of a trendy topic. And so let's delve into it.
Narcissism is really trendy right now. It's one of those.
You can't go anywhere without hearing about how somebody's a narcissist or whatever.
Well,
and so I think this will be very helpful material.
And then, not to get all political, but President Trump definitely fits the diagnostic criteria that's been said by multiple professionals over multiple platforms. And so having President Trump in office definitely brought a greater awareness to narcissistic personality disorder for sure.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Now, having said that, one of the myths that we are going to be dispelling today is narcissism a bad thing? And the answer is, it absolutely can be, but it not always is. And so we're going to really dig into some of that. So do I think, Sarah Westbrook, that many of the leaders in the hierarchy of the Mormon church, and for that matter, many different church organizations or businesses and corporations and those types of things? Yeah, absolutely. I do believe that they do. And I believe that Nelson and Oakes and Bednar have all demonstrated on multiple occasions some really narcissistic tendencies or characteristic traits. And we're going to explain those, but that doesn't necessarily mean that narcissism in and of itself is a bad thing.
Well, I like that clarification. And of course, you're going to get more into that and explain why that's the case.
And I'm always right. So,
sure, that doesn't sound narcissistic at all.
Not
so let's talk about that.
A little bit. All righty. So I want to make sure that we set our intention. Our intention is to help our listeners understand and differentiate between narcissistic personality disorder, which is usually very toxic, I would say almost always, and narcissistic personality characteristics or tendencies or traits. I hear that word, the narcissistic personality characteristics, tendencies, and traits used quite interchangeably. And so I will probably be using those today interchangeably as well. And oftentimes those characteristics are not maladaptive, and we're gonna talk about like toxic narcissism versus self-confidence, because the two are very much related. So we're going to help you learn how to differentiate between those two from a psychoeducational standpoint.
A very self-confident person can sound quite arrogant sometimes, and so then of course it translates into, especially if you don't like that person, right? Obviously they're narcissistic.
Well, and one of the things that's really interesting for me is that when I was working through some of the issues with my parents, we saw a counselor who was very adept at identifying personality disorders. Like that was one of her specialties. And what was really interesting is I told my parents, you guys pick the counselor, and they picked her. And she diagnosed, both of my parents on the personality spectrum, and was able to really substantiate to me why she felt that, which led in a lot of ways, led to the final straw for me to say, okay, yeah, this isn't going to work, and to disengage with my parents on a permanent basis. And so this is very interesting. But if you ask my parents, especially my dad, he's going to tell you that I have narcissistic personality disorder, but his reasons for why I have it are pointing more to what most people and what I would consider healthy self-confidence, comfort with having my voice heard and speaking up for myself, a comfort with advocating for others. So yeah, there are some traits or characteristics that are seemingly narcissistic that are not toxic, and we're really going to dig into how do I tell the difference between the two, because self-confidence is not a negative thing.
Right, that's something for us to seek after and develop in our lives.
Well, for some people, sure. Some people are, happy to be more quiet and observers. But yes, I don't want people to be self-conscious. But that doesn't mean that you have to be as noisy in your confidence as I am. And I'm a noisy person. So the other thing that we want to do today is we want to talk about how to identify when narcissistic personality disorder characteristics, tendencies, or traits are becoming abusive, and how to engage with somebody that you love when you are able to identify that there's some narcissism going on within those relationships, because it's really important for us to know how to protect our boundaries. There are some very specific characteristics within narcissistic personality disorder that make communication almost a moot point. Like it's very difficult to communicate with them. And so we're going to teach you how to identify that and how to protect yourself, how to honor your boundaries.
For the record, point of order, it's a moot point, Joey.
It's a cow point.
Yeah, no. No. I know Joey's explanation on Friends was very good, but it's a moot point.
Okay, hang on. What did Joey say? I remember the joke.
It's like a cow's opinion. Like, it doesn't matter.
I like Joey's response. It's moot. You know what? Honestly, I like that better than moot.
I know you do, and that's okay.
Joey's my guy, y'all.
Yeah.
Joey is he's my buddy at heart.
But you don't go
to
Matt Joey
LeBlanc
for definitions of real things.
Mason, we make up our own words on this podcast all the time.
But we don't change the definition of real words.
It's a moot point, you all. It's a cow's opinion. Okay, here we go.
Moving on.
Moving right along. So I feel like the best place for us to start is in the DSM.
Sure.
So the DSM is the diagnostic.
Let's talk about what the actual definitions are.
So y'all study the Bible and the Book of Mormon, and I study the Bible of Mental Health Disorders, commonly known as the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Health Disorders. We are going to be working from the 5th edition text revision, or the DSM-5TR. This is published by the American Psychiatric Association, and this latest edition was released just this year in 2022.
Just in case you just have one sitting around your house and want to follow along.
Hey, y'all, if you are not in the behavioral health field, do not buy this book, because you will suddenly be diagnosing everybody in your life. I remember in school when I was first introduced to the DSM, it was when I was in my bachelor's program, and they warned us, like, unless you are taking a class on how to diagnose mental disorders, this book is very dangerous because you could basically diagnose anybody with anything you want to, because these are all, a criteria of the human condition. But it is really beneficial. This is the manual that we use in my field for diagnostics, for communication across the profession. So that way, if I, refer somebody with, we'll say, bipolar disorder, or I say, like, oh yeah, they have bipolar 2, the receiving provider has an indication of what the traits or tendencies or what they're looking for and what they're treating right off the bat.
You've kind of explained this piece before.
Right. Yeah. And then the other piece of this is that you get a little code. So if you think about like billing and coding, these are the numbers that I put into my charting system on the computer. In order for insurance to pay me, I have to give a diagnostic, or I have to diagnose you with something in order for insurance companies to pay me for services that I've provided. And so in this case, we'll be talking about narcissistic personality disorder, which is on page 760 of the metallic blue covered DSM. It's very pretty, you all. When they redid it,
you have one sitting around
when they
your
redid
house.
they designed it. It is a lot more user-friendly and engaging. The other one was very boring. And the words are pretty much very similar. There's some very specific changes. For the most part, the book has stayed relatively true to what we've looked at for years, which is pretty normal. I think they update this thing every, 5 to 10 years or so. So anyway, the diagnostic number on this would be F60.81. And what that is that's the number that I put into the charting system that identifies the diagnosis across all of the, insurance and medical speak systems. And then if I was treating you, I would give the service code.
Get a t-shirt that says looking for 50 point whatever it was number you just said.
F60.81.
Who knows?
Mason, you can identify airplanes in the sky by their number, type, and whatever. And I can recognize numbers from the DSM if I use them. I actually would not have been able to pull this one out of my fanny because it's not like, no. I pay attention to the 90837, which is the code I use to get paid. That's the one I remember. Alrighty. So let's go ahead and read through these. And I think that this first point, we're really going to belabor one of the points in here on purpose, because this is really important in order to understand the difference between narcissism as a personality disorder versus narcissism as a characteristic or personality trait.
Right, sure.
So I'm going to read this directly from the DSM, and it says, narcissistic personality disorder has to have, and I quote, a pervasive pattern of grandiosity in fantasy or behavior, a need for admiration, and lack of empathy. So I want us to come back to that lack of empathy when I finish the statement here in a minute. It has to start beginning by early adulthood and present in a variety of contexts as indicated by five or more of the following. And I'm going to read the 9 symptoms of narcissism here in a minute, but I really want to come back to that lack of empathy. So when we talk about the difference of narcissism from somebody has a lot of self-confidence, they're very motivated and driven, they're very successful, they might be proud of what they have produced, those types of things, that person may have a lot of, they might be, special or unique. A lot of people are very intelligent, so it's difficult for them to have conversations with other people that are not at that same intelligence level. Like my son Brig and I were talking about Elon Musk, and apparently Brig told me that Elon Musk has a really difficult time communicating with a lot of people because he's just so brilliant. That's something that we see in a lot of people who are very, very high IQs. That does not necessarily mean that he has a narcissistic personality disorder. I don't follow Elon Musk at all, so I wouldn't be able to say one way or the other because all I know is that he's the richest dude in the world and he just bought Twitter because that's what my kids keep talking about.
Well, and just a quick question there, just maybe that would help clarify for me, is that there's a difference between having a difficult time communicating with someone because of a difference in intelligence level and essentially not caring about being able to.
Well, and that's where I was going before I was rudely interrupted by your hand waving in the air that you wanted to say something.
Oh, I thought you were rudely interrupted by Elon Musk.
What? Oh my gosh. All right. So the difference between somebody who's highly intelligent and has a difficult time speaking with somebody, or somebody who's very successful and proud of their achievements, and a disordered personality is that lack of empathy.
Right.
It's very important to identify that if a person truly has narcissistic personality disorder, they lack empathy. And that needs to be in more than one context. So I hear a lot of spouses come to me and say, yeah, I was married to a narcissist. And when I start talking to them, there's no formal diagnosis, which is normal. It's pretty normal for narcissists to not go in and find out what's wrong with them.
Right. Because there's nothing wrong with them.
Right. There's nothing wrong with them. And they tend to blame other people for everything going on in their life. Right. And so as I start talking to them, I find oftentimes it's narcissistic traits that have been abusive or really hurtful, but that in all other areas of the, supposed narcissistic spouse's interactions, like they're great parents, they're always there and showing up for their kids. They don't need admiration from their kids. They have, good relationships at work. They get along with lots and lots of people. And it gets kind of sticky because getting along with a lot of people can be a narcissistic thing. So we're really looking at empathy. How well is the individual able to connect with the emotions of others, and how well are they able to identify and hold space for how their choices, actions, words, so on and so forth affect the people around them.
The mighty and resilient Merrimack River, carving through the communities of our great region. My name is Linda Lorden, proud president of Merrimack County Savings Bank. And like the river that serves as our namesake, we're a constant yet ever-changing presence. Because to us, it's bigger than banking. It's about powering communities and putting people first. It's about knowing where you came from and where you're going. That's Merrimack style. Visit us at themerrimack.com.
So some of the myths of narcissism is that if you demonstrate one of these things or two of these things, you suddenly have the personality disorder. Again, narcissism right now is super duper trendy. And we're hearing a lot of lay diagnostics going on where it's like, yeah, I was married to a narcissist and I was married to, and we're kind of using this word narcissist when it might be, my marriage didn't work out because we struggled with some selfishness and those types of things in the relationship. So narcissistic traits can also be what we would call in our field adaptive or maladaptive, having a lot of self-confidence, and having a lot of people be jealous of you. That would be one here. There's a lot of words here. An unwillingness to recognize. Hang on a sec. Let me just. My brain just went totally blank. Being unique or not feeling understood by a lot of people because of your achievements does not necessarily mean you have the disorder.
Right.
And, if you're highly driven, highly focused and whatnot, you can have some narcissistic traits that are quote unquote adaptive, meaning they are serving that individual well. But then again, on that backside, we're looking at, are they harming people in their wake?
Right.
I've worked for a lot of really driven people who they're kind of bossy. I'm kind of bossy. And whatnot. And there's almost this, like, when I ask you to bring this tool, I expect it right now. And a lot of people would identify that as a sense of entitlement, which is a trait of narcissism. I would say you've got to look at the motivation.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's going on in there. If it's just I'm super focused on whatever it is I'm doing and I'm being a little bossy, we can address that from a bossy place. That does not translate into narcissism. So
Right.
I would say let's put out some, words of caution. We tend to overuse this term in our society right now. And we need to, have a little bit of respect and honor that there's lots of other things going on for people who may have some narcissistic characteristics and whatnot. We've really got to look at motivation, harm, and again, that strong key piece is the empathy piece.
Yeah. Well, and you mentioned too, like, they've got to have such and such a number of these things. And that's the case for pretty much all of your psychological diagnoses. It's the case really for most medical diagnoses. You can't come in to the hospital and your labs that represent your kidney function are off with no other symptoms, and they're immediately going to go, well, you have kidney cancer, right? That's just not the way it's going to work.
Right.
You've got to have a collection of symptoms that narrow into this is what's going on. So yeah, you can have a couple of these tendencies and maybe even be really strong in your life, but until you've got this grouping of differences or diagnostic criteria, you're not going to be able to say, yeah, this is what's going on.
Right. Absolutely. Alrighty. So are we ready for the 9, I'm going to call these symptoms or characteristics of this disorder?
I think we're ready.
Alrighty. So you remember, you have to have at least 5 of these. They have to be pervasive.
So if you're writing these down for your husband or wife or father, mother,
if you
make
are
sure you're keeping track.
Right. If you are trying to diagnose somebody right now, beware of confirmation bias. Okay. And yes, you have to have at least 5 of these. They have to be pervasive, meaning they happen
can't just come every once
all
in
the
a
time,
while.
right? This is not an every now and then thing. This is a pervasive pattern of behavior in a variety of situations. So if it's like, oh, they're only this way with me, then they're not fitting that diagnostic criteria. So across a variety of contexts. And also, if you're not a licensed professional who has been trained in diagnostics, just do yourself a favor, relax, and let's just enjoy the learning process here. Because diagnosing somebody, recognizing that somebody has an illness is one thing. Diagnosing them, that those labels are can be really hurtful. And this is one of those. Like, I know there have been a couple times where I've had to diagnose borderline personality in somebody, and it was like heart-wrenching because, yeah. And it's also important to say that most personality disorders come from individuals who have extreme unresolved trauma.
Right. Well, and we're going to talk about boundaries later and how you can communicate with people in these situations. So this is not about you diagnosing someone, but if in your head you're thinking, oh, yeah, there's that. Oh, yeah, there's that. Oh, yeah, there's that. That is going to better inform you about how to manage this relationship.
Right. Because today's podcast is about recognizing when narcissistic traits or disorders are abusing you. Like when they've become an abuse tactic towards you and what you need to do about it.
Right. It's not their existence. It's the fact that they're affecting your relationship and how you manage it. So,
Alrighty. So number 1 has a grandiose sense of self-importance, And this is demonstrated by exaggerates achievements and talents, expects to be recognized as superior without commensurate achievements. Now, I'm going to talk a lot about my parents tonight because one of them carries this diagnosis, as well as with some strong borderline tendencies as an overt narcissist, and the other one kind of carries some more covert narcissist tendencies.
Yeah, blessing for you right there, huh?
Which actually, as a side note, when somebody has, if you're trying to diagnose your spouse, beware that I'm about ready to drop a brick on your head here. There's a phenomenon in the mental health world where when one partner has true narcissistic personality disorder, they are almost always married to somebody who fits the diagnostic criteria for borderline personality disorder. For whatever reason, those two personality types really attract to each other. And I think those numbers are as high as like over 80% of individuals who are diagnosed with true narcissism, with true narcissistic personality disorder, are married to somebody with borderline.
Well, and hopefully that can be informative too, right? If you're seeing these kind of things, hopefully it can help inform you of where you are too, and then you can seek the help that you need to manage it.
What my experience has been is that when you take these diagnoses, you're looking at somebody who is coming out of a home life in early childhood that was incredibly traumatic. They weren't allowed to talk about it, and so they've got a lot of unresolved trauma. And so it makes sense that two people who have some maladaptive behaviors are attracted to each other because they share trauma histories and they can connect over some of those difficulties. But if we're not learning how to work through those, we can develop a lot of personality disordered issues. The other thing that a lot of people will say is that if you have the diagnosis, you'll never get over it. And I would say right now I have about, I only take one or two individuals diagnosed with borderline personality disorder at a time in my clinic because there's a lot of boundary issues there. And it can be mentally draining and exhausting to work with somebody on the borderline personality spectrum. And so in my career, I've been in clinical practice now, for just over a decade. Yeah, just over a decade. I've had 8 borderline patients, and of those 8 that completed, I've had 8 that have completed treatment. 6 of them are still in remission. And so you can overcome these tendencies. Absolutely. These are not a permanent state of being. You can change, but it's hard. I would say my borderlines are generally in regular sessions with me for at least 3 years. In order to, that's just my clinic. I'm sure somebody else has better stats than me, but for me, I generally see them for at least 3 years.
Well, that's a small grouping, but it's still helpful to see. And
well, and my numbers, I'm like 3 years, and I only would do 1 or 2 at a time over the course of a decade. My numbers are a little bit off here. But
well, and a medical diagnosis is never meant to be like a stamp of this is what you own forever,
right?
Whether it's medical or psychological. The hope is still to work through and overcome and at least be able to live a happy, fulfilling life.
Well, and one of the really interesting things here is that what we're talking about really is the damage that a diagnostic label can do to somebody. Yeah. Because we see the label, not the person. So we're going to, call that out as well. Okay, so number 1 has a grandiose sense of self-importance, exaggerates achievements and talents, expects to be recognized as superior without commensurate achievements. This was something that was really modeled for me in childhood. My dad was an educator, and I remember growing up and hearing he was always the best educator in his school. He always knew the most. All the other teachers were doing it wrong. When he was a principal, he would say, look how awesome of a principal I am. Look at how my school scores are against these other schools. And, I used to be really proud of him, was like, wow, look how awesome my dad is, which feeds into, diagnostic criteria number 4, which is requires excessive admiration. So it definitely worked. My dad definitely got that admiration, at least from me for sure. And it took a lot of growing up for me to go, wait a minute, his maybe he's excellent at hiring and training teachers, but he doesn't seem to be giving any of the credit for his school's success to the people in the trenches who are actually engaging with the students on a day-to-day basis. So one of the things that I see in narcissism, in the personality disorder, is taking credit for other people's achievements as their own. And again, that exaggeration of achievements and talents is a big one. And that's actually a trait that I struggled with in my early 20s, which I think we've talked about that a little bit on the podcast. Maybe we haven't. Have
Exaggeration, but I don't think we talked about you taking credit for other people's accomplishments.
Did I take credit? I don't think I took credit for other people's accomplishments.
That doesn't ring a bell for me.
No, but it's exaggerating my skills in order to seek attention and validation from others was definitely something that I struggled with in my late teens and into my 20s until I started working with Jim. All right, so diagnostic criteria number 2 is somebody who is preoccupied with fantasies of unlimited success, power, brilliance, beauty, or ideal love. Now, this is usually a trait that at least in my experience, that is more covert narcissistic, meaning it's much more subtle. It's harder to identify because most often this preoccupation is going on inside somebody's head.
And that's something they're announcing to the world about how awesome they are.
Well, and some people absolutely announce to the world, and Trump. It's Donald Trump. He's absolutely. This is something that Donald Trump definitely does. In the Mormon church, what I see is the preoccupation with fantasies of the existential achievements that you're going to get. Like after you die, if I do all of these things, I'm going to fantasize about the perfect family in heaven and the happy marriage and standing in front of God. And, the people who judged me, God is going to make sure that they know that I did this right, those types of things. And so this is a lot more subtle. It's a lot harder to identify. This is something that, the individual experiencing it would have to be honest with themselves.
Okay.
Now, again, it is healthy and normal for us to fantasize and set goals and dream. Dreaming is healthy. So if you're dreaming about where you want to get to and whatnot, that does not make you a narcissist, not at all. Or unhealthy or maladaptive.
Well, I think that's a big, important part of all of these things that you're saying is that none of these in and of themselves are necessarily a good or bad thing. They are a thing. And you can recognize them and use them to your benefit, or you can recognize them and go, yeah, that's not helping me, like you said, at adaptive or maladaptive.
Right.
And we're not looking for a title. We're not looking for a label. We're looking for pieces of us that we can mold and move and recognize or just sit with so that we are more aware of who we are and where we go from here.
Right. Well, and I really want to kind of, tune into that word preoccupied. Because I've got a client right now that is doing some life coaching, something or other. So they see me for counseling, and then they're doing this life coaching thing, which is like the power of positive thinking as it applies to business achievements and financial growth and those types of things. And the difference is that, there's a great deal of health in, saying I am and visualizing I am going to get to this place. I am going to make these accomplishments. The difference between that type of powerful, positive growth and self-motivation and self-motivating self-talk, blah, 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 blah. I'm using the word self a lot right now. The difference between that and this preoccupation is that word preoccupation, meaning it's so distracting, it's occupying a lot of my brain space, and also that they are fantasies. They're not based in reality.
You mean like my son who dreams that he's going to be the next LeBron James but doesn't practice basketball?
Sure. But that doesn't mean that he has narcissism.
No, not at all. Not at all.
That would be the son with schizophrenia who struggles with reality-based thinking to begin with.
But the idea being that you're fantasizing about something that you think is real and possible, but not necessarily doing anything to actually make it possible. Is that kind of what you're saying?
No, because there's a lot of people, like if we go back to Donald Trump, he's definitely somebody who has achieved a great deal of success and power. He's married to a porn star model, and Melania is an extremely intelligent woman who speaks multiple languages and whatnot. I find it interesting that she's the most silenced first lady of all time.
Yeah.
That I, at least in my lifetime for sure, which isn't that long, but I mean, it's almost like she's arm candy because of her beauty. And those are, I'm going to get a lot of heat from saying that, because that's a strong judgment call. I haven't heard enough from Melania to be able to make any kind of, opinion of who she is in that role at all. And whether that's because Trump is protecting her from the public or because this is part of, look how successful I am, look how rich I am, look how brilliant I am. I don't take shit from anybody. And I have one of the most beautiful women in the world as my wife. There's definitely some question marks there. We got to be careful. We don't want to Trump bash too much.
No, definitely not.
Here, that's not the point, right? And a lot of people actually admire Trump for his narcissistic traits because he gets stuff done. He's kind of an asshole in the process, but he does get stuff done.
Yes, he does.
Alrighty, so number 3 is believes that he or she is special and unique and can only be understood by or should associate with other special or high status people or institutions. This one kind of makes me giggle. It reminds me of a client that I had who had never graduated from college, barely graduated from high school, but somehow knew more about mental health than I did. And which is, that can happen. Absolutely. I do not want to say I have a master's degree, therefore I know more. Absolutely not. I think I'm, a part of that phenomenon. The more I learn, the more I recognize I don't know.
Absolutely.
But this client came in, I was like, well, how much time have you spent studying? Like, where are you gaining this knowledge from? And it was, there was nothing to substantiate where the knowledge came from. It was almost like, well, I just know, and this is why. And I hang out with this really important person and that really important person and this really important person over here. And we've talked about it. And like, there was no, well, I've read this study written by, whatever. I've read all of Brene Brown's books, and so I really have a good understanding of how shame can be maladaptive in my life, and I really feel like I'm straight. Like, there was none of that. It was all,
I just know.
I know because I associate with educated people.
Osmosis.
One of my few narcissistic clients, and I don't think he came back after the second session because I was too stupid for him. But yeah, that was, he told me that, and he had no issues telling me that. He was like, your degrees mean nothing to me. You obviously don't know what you're talking about. Had to do with me telling him that we needed to work on not criticizing his wife as much, and I'm too stupid. It was very fascinating. What do you know? Yeah. All righty. Number 4, we've already touched on, which is that requires excessive admiration. This, I see a lot of somebody who does really good things, but they can't let it go unnoticed. And I'm not talking about the, like the scene from Mace. What's that movie where, is it Meg Ryan and Hugh Jackman, and they fall off the bridge and go back in time? And
oh yeah. Yeah.
What's the name of that movie?
Kate and Leopold.
Kate and Leopold.
Yeah.
Not like the Kate and Leopold scene of start the dishwasher just as the woman walks in the door so she knows you did the dishes. This is not what we're talking about.
That's healthy accolades right there, right?
Right. This is, I'm seeking for people to notice. I need the compliments. If I don't get them, I start to shame people. I get irritable. I get grumpy. Like we are talking about, because this is requires it, not enjoys it. There's a difference. Like when people give me compliments, there's a level of I enjoy it. I'm like, yeah, thanks.
Most of us enjoy compliments.
I wouldn't say most. I've got a lot of clients who compliments make them very uncomfortable. But yeah, it's normal to appreciate and enjoy recognition. But they require it within their relationships, whether those be work relationships or familial relationships. And if it's not given, there will be that punishment. There's going to be a cost. Narcissism is very passive aggressive, especially in covert narcissism. It's very passive aggressive. And we see that a lot in this need for admiration. And one of the things that's really interesting, or that I see in my clinic, is the spouse of narcissists are very good at giving that excessive admiration. And it's almost like I can watch. Like, it's this really weird dynamic that I can't really explain. If you're in my field, you know what I'm talking about. But it's like they're giving the compliments and the admiration and building their partner up in the session as a protective barrier. It's like, if I don't build you up, my vulnerability is not safe unless I am constantly building you up. And then the really interesting thing is when I separate them and interview the couples individually, I get a whole new story. Usually, the
makes
admiration
sense for an
is
abusive
dropped.
relationship. That kind of stuff happens all the time too.
Oh yeah,
so, yeah.
Oh yeah. I always enjoy when I interview my couples and they come in, and then when I do their individual interviews before we start their therapy, when their stories are matching at every step of the way, it's like, all right, we're doing good. Like, this is a huge strength for us. Absolutely. And it happens about 50% of the time. The other 50% of the time, we've got very different perspectives. Also normal. Different perspectives does not mean disordered. Alrighty. Number 5 has a sense of entitlement, which is unreasonable expectations of especially favorable treatment or automatic compliance with his or her expectations. And that automatic compliance, we're going to come back to that when we start talking about high demand religious organizations and the leadership within the Mormon church specifically. The next one is interpersonally exploitive. So the individual is interpersonally exploitive, which is they take advantage of others in order to achieve his or her own ends. And again, we've got to add in without regards to how that affects the people around them. And that's a big deal. That lack of empathy is, again, key to understanding the difference between a narcissistic personality disorder and a narcissistic characteristic or trait. Number 7, here it is again, lacks empathy. And not only do they lack empathy, but you're going to see an unwillingness and even an argumentiveness. So it says, is unwilling to recognize or identify with the feelings and needs of others. And this was something that really led to the diagnosis by that therapist that was in charge of our family counseling, is that as we were going around the room and explaining what was going on and trying to work through things, there was a gross lack of accountability and a refusal to recognize. The therapist said, when I was doing the individual interviews and whatnot, it didn't matter how I reworded it or how I kind of brought it, do you think this? And even it was like when she would validate, it would grow the insistence that Sarah was wrong and Sarah was at fault and Sarah is unreasonable and it's all Sarah's fault and whatnot, to the point that when I said, okay, I'm going to cut ties, there was a point in that where my father actually flipped the tables, because I went into counseling saying, if we can't work this out, then we can't have contact anymore. Like, this is getting too toxic for myself and for my kids and for my family. Right. And at the end of the therapy, it was my dad who was like, it's my idea to cut off contact. Like, he had switched those roles. It was like, Sarah actually wants the relationship with me, but I'm not willing to do it with her anymore. And that was kind of like that, in real time, seeing that turning of tables, that blaming, but it's an unwillingness to recognize or identify with the feelings and needs of others. So again, this lack of empathy, I'm going to say, has got to be present in order for the diagnosis to happen. So if you think about like the caveat in the beginning, it has to happen in this way, and then it gives you the 9 things, then you have number 7, which is like lacks empathy with a lack of empathy. Go ahead and that's literally what the book says.
Just kind of a clarifying question on that one. to be diagnosed narcissistic, do they have to have the inability to empathize, or it's just that they choose not to, they're unwilling to do it?
I think it's hard to understand somebody's motivation. What I would say in my own professional practice is there's a lot of resistance that is not willing to relent. So it looks like an unwillingness, but when we talk about the amygdala and the frontal cortex, there's no way for me to know if that unwillingness is actually an inability. And so, I just don't know.
That makes sense. Okay.
I'm sure that to most of us experiencing it, it feels like it's a choice.
Sure, that makes sense too.
But I've been doing this long enough to know that traumatized brains do a lot of really hurtful things. Because, when we talk about this lack of empathy harms the individual with narcissism as well.
Sure, yeah.
And almost always, an essential feature of narcissism is that the individual who touts themselves as this great, strong, educated person is actually suffering from a very significant lack of self-confidence. They are generally incredibly insecure and self-conscious, and a lot of these, the theory is that these behaviors that elevate them are protective so that nobody sees just how vulnerable they are. And so it's really difficult for me to be able to say, are they unwilling or are they unable? It took me a long time. I talk about what's going on with me and my dad and my mom. It doesn't make me angry anymore. It really doesn't. It's just become, this is how my life has been. This is my experience. Yeah, it's just what it is. There's not a lot of emotional reactivity anymore for it. And it took me until I was no longer entrenched in it to be willing to step away and say, I don't think my dad is able to understand. I think that there is such deep shame of how he has abused me throughout my life that admitting to it would just destroy him as a human being.
Right.
Because a lot of the way that he abused me, it's not even spoken of, and he feels that it's still justified. Like,
right.
The most obvious signs of abuse occurred when I was 16, and to this day, I'm 41. Well, I can't say to this day because I haven't talked to him in almost a year now at all. But when we were in those sessions, it was still very much, that was Sarah's fault. If she hadn't blah, 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 then I wouldn't have. Right. And I mean, y'all, I was held prisoner in my own home for months. Months. And we're not talking about, oh, you're grounded. We're talking about, I didn't go anywhere without my mom tagging along, except to work. And I wasn't even allowed to walk to or from work. So work was 4 blocks away from my house. So I used to walk. And then after that, I wasn't allowed to walk. Like, my mom would drop me off, and she had her little spies to make sure that I didn't leave. And then she would come and pick me up at the end of my shift. But the only time I had away from my mother was the couple of weekend shifts that I did at Ed's IGA and Snowflake during that time period.
So I like how you explained that, whether or not it's that they're unable to be empathetic or they just don't know how or whatever. I love that. You said something that really resonated with me too, that I think that the reason my dad struggles with it is there's so much shame there that it would kill him to then let it all out there. Like his vulnerabilities, his shame, if they were all out for the world to see, or even for a couple of people to see, he probably feels like he would implode. And the reason that resonated is actually, we've talked a little bit about some of the struggles that we have with the Mormon church in general. I'm sure this is the case with other religions as well, but specifically with the Mormon church, there's so much sticky history going on that they have never been able to really truly deal with, that it's almost like they feel like if we just brought all of this out into the open, all of this, we're just going to lay it all out on the table and say this is what it is, they probably feel like they or the church would just implode. And so I love that explanation, because it can happen on that individual level, or it can happen on an organizational level, where there's just so much that you don't know how to deal with, that you feel like dealing with it would just completely implode you or destroy you.
That's something that, like, RFM and Bill Reel bring up quite frequently in their Mormonism Live thing is that, the church can't come out and say Brigham Young was a racist and so were all of these prophets afterwards, because those racist prophets said things about blacks as prophecy from the pulpit, saying it would never change, as if they were directly in communication with God.
Right.
So to
as if it was coming from God.
That, right. To undo that, you have to admit that the prophets are fallible. And we've talked forever about prophets are not infallible, which is why, here we are. Is the prophet a narcissist? I think in that way, it's definitely a strong trait in that they are unwilling to recognize or identify how those things have been hurtful. It's just, it happened. It was a long time ago. We fixed it. Leave it alone.
Get over it. And
get over it. Don't talk about it. Leave it alone. We're not going to go there. And it doesn't, your feelings should be over because we fixed it. Like, stop feeling hurt because they got the priesthood in 78 or whatever year it was. So it's all better now. Leave it alone. And it's like, we've got generational trauma, social trauma, familial trauma, blah, 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 blah. Trauma.
And we're going to talk about that and some examples of that here just down the road, not too far from here. But I appreciated that explanation and the way that it applies to multiple different situations. So
absolutely.
All right. Moving on.
Number 8 is often envious of others or believes that others are envious of him or her. And I know this one kind of makes me chuckle. This was my dad all the time. Like, why doesn't that person talk to us anymore? Oh, they're just jealous of us. And they're jealous of us because that person wishes that they had it as good as us. And y'all, we did not have that good. So I'm not sure what he was talking about. Not that we were poor or anything, but we were poor. We weren't like destitute poor. My dad worked his ass off to make sure that our
you guys
needs
had what you
were
needed.
met. Yeah. But my goodness, our home was not the ideal Mormon home growing up. We were a dysfunctional mess. And we still are. Okay. And number 9 shows arrogant, haughty behaviors or attitudes. I think at this point, Mason, I kind of want to reiterate what you said, that these criterias, these characteristic criterias that they have for the diagnosis of narcissistic personality disorder are actions that are usually taken to protect the individual experiencing them from having their vulnerabilities seen. And so when we're talking about the lay person, what are some of the things that you're going to see if you're not the one with it, if you're associating with it? You're going to see indications of really low self-esteem. You're going to see a lot of symptoms of anxiety or depression, a lot of shame and guilt. Oftentimes narcissists over time will become very introverted or socially withdrawn. And a lot of that can be because they've have a difficult time with interpersonal relationships beyond just the superficial.
Which makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. A tendency to be passive aggressive and very defensive. And that's absolutely something that I see. Like, my mother is definitely the passive aggressive person, and my dad is super defensive. They have a lot of avoidant behaviors. I'm not going to go to that because, then I have to, perform, or I don't want to go to that because then people are going to see that I'm not as good. They have a tendency to play or feel like they are the victim. And y'all, if you know my dad, that is my dad. My dad is the perpetual victim all the time. And it's something that he learned from his mother. My grandmother was also very much the perpetual victim. Everybody was out to get her. Everybody was against her. She was the innocent victim. In her divorce, she did nothing wrong. And, as an adult, I look at that, I'm like, you had multiple affairs and you did nothing wrong. Like there's a huge disconnect there, but it's she's the victim. And then the tendency to engage in vindictive behaviors. So Mason, is my dad vindictive?
Just a little bit, yeah. I mean, I say that. I never really felt that from your dad. For some reason, your dad did not ever feel like he needed to treat me that way. But he certainly treated you that way, and he's treated some of my children that way.
Yeah. Well, the letters the emails he and I exchanged that you got to read, I think was really the first exposure you had to my dad unfiltered.
Well, yeah, because ordinarily what would happen is he would behave that way towards you when I wasn't home.
Right. When you were home, he was very nice and pleasant
when
to
I
be
came
around.
home, yeah. Mm-hmm. So
Yeah. When Mason wasn't there, he was a completely different person than when Mason was there. When Mason was gone, I was the target. Everything was my fault. I was never enough. I was never good enough. I had to worship the ground he walked on. It was pretty rough. He gaslit me like blah, 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 blah.
Right.
But as soon as you walked in the door, he was the perfect grandpa playing with the kids, congratulating you, Mason, on your successes. Like, it was a very significant personality switch.
Yeah.
Other things would be hypersensitivity to criticism, being very, very self-conscious. And again, they've got introversion on this thing that I'm doing, or this thing that I'm reading off of right now. Okay, the other things are the abusive behaviors. So now that we've talked about narcissistic, the diagnostic criteria, it's important again to recognize that you've got overt and covert. Overt is very observable. It's somewhat easy to identify and say that there it is, that's the behavior, that's the moment. So like in my dad, I can say, Mason, the emails that my dad and I exchanged are an excellent, like every single, I've had 3 counselors have read those emails. Like 3 professionals. I was like, hey, I want you to read these emails. It might be more than that. I said, I want you to read these emails and let me know, did I say or do something wrong in them? Because I want to own it if I did. And sometimes it's hard for me to see that when I'm around my parents. And every single one of them came back and they were like, whoa, your dad is not a healthy person. And
right.
Yeah. And one of them told me, you floodlighted your dad. Like, you gave him too many things all at once. But other than that, which I agree with.
Right. Yeah, we've talked about that. That's not it.
All right. So yeah, if you want to know what I'm talking about, read my upcoming book. It's coming in the spring, y'all. Okay. So what are the 4 abusive behaviors that narcissists tend to engage in? Go ahead, Mason.
I know.
He knows. He studied.
Gaslighting.
Okay, so pause. What is gaslighting?
So gaslighting is making someone else feel like they're the crazy one. And you probably need to explain that better. But yes, the idea being that you're doing something to them and making them believe that they're actually the one doing it to you.
Right. So gaslighting occurs when somebody invalidates your experiences, minimizes or trivializes the things that you have gone through, your thoughts, your opinions. And yes, it
religions
often,
don't do that at all, right?
Not at all. Yeah.
Yeah, that one's definitely written down.
Dripping in sarcasm, religions never do that. Yeah.
Right.
No. And at its very worst, it can cause you to question your own reality.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Number 2? Or did you want to talk about gaslighting
silent treatment?
More?
The silent treatment is a big one that covert narcissists do. They'll just go silent on you.
Right. They don't want to be blatantly conflictual, right? Overtly looking for conflict, so they'll go silent.
Playing the victim, pouting is a big one.
Is this all part of gaslighting?
Nope, these are the 4.
Other behaviors.
These are the 4. Playing the victim is one of them. So we've got...
these aren't the 4 you told me.
Okay, well, maybe there's more. There's probably more. All right.
Maybe.
So
well, then some of what you're talking about falls into the categories that I have written down too. So
okay.
Go ahead.
So playing the victim or blaming others for everything that goes bad.
Right. That's all part of manipulation, which is one of the things that I have written down, right? Those are all ways to manipulate somebody.
Yep. Yeah, well, and that's what all of these behaviors are about. And then the other one is discredits you, and so that way other people don't believe you. So they will go out of their way. So one of the things that Mason, you and I had talked about is that when somebody has narcissism, it's really hard oftentimes for society to see it. Like if you look at my dad, there are most people
Many people would argue with your interpretation of him. Yes.
Right. Most people who engage with my father think he's very kind, think he's very generous. All these things. Even your dad at one point recently had said something to you along the lines of, Sarah just needs to forgive and forget and move on. And you were like, you don't know what's gone on there. Like,
Right.
you can't make that. But my dad is very generous. One of the things that's really interesting is as mine and my dad's relationship started to fall apart, my dad started offering his help to your dad to build his house.
I didn't know that, I think. Well, no, I did. I remember him saying that. Yeah, okay. Yeah.
And at the time of our relationship was like, you know, it was the visit before we did the counseling where I was like, I'm done, I'm out, I'm over. We're not going to do this anymore. Right. And so my dad has sabotaged my relationship with my siblings. So from the time I was itty bitty, my brother and I were pitted against each other in competition. It was always which one of us can one up the other one in order to get the attention that we needed. And Daddy was the hero. And so that really fed into my dad's need for admiration and being the best dad and, you know, all of these things and the constant, oh, well, you're better at your brother than this. Oh, you're better at your sister than this. Like this constant competition. And then when I hit my teen years, you know, as the more I began to develop, my siblings were told about how horrible I was and how I mistreated my dad. So once I had sex prior to marriage, I embarrassed my dad. Like a lead girl could not cross that boundary. That was the breakable boundary. And after that, I was criminalized to my siblings. And to this day, I do not have a positive relationship with most of my siblings. My brother is an expert on who I am, according to him. And we have spent less than 7 days together in 24 years.
Right. Well, and if that's the way you feel about somebody, you're going to be searching for confirmation bias, right? You're searching for things that are going to demonstrate that that's the case.
Right. And it does not, because... You know, one of the other things that I want to kind of point out here to illustrate this, they sabotage the relationships. Like they isolate you by sabotaging the relationships around you. Right. This is a common narcissistic personality disorder. There's a lack of empathy for what this does to, you know, me or to my kids or even to my siblings who now don't have a relationship with their sister, is that my siblings cannot tell my dad, you know, that's really unfair to Sarah. Because if they stick up for me, they become his target. Right. And then he will do to them what he's done to me. Right. And nobody wants to be on my dad's bad side. It's been really interesting as I've made that, you know, as I'm making this more public presence for myself. It was a couple of years ago, I had somebody reach out because of a post that had been shared on Facebook. And she reached out and she says, hey, I'd like to friend you. You're friends with so-and-so. You went to high school with them. I was a few years ahead of you in school. Mason is still getting over the flu, y'all. Goodness. So on and so forth. Well, you're not getting over it. You've just got that residual, like, chronic cough going on here now. Right. So anyway, when she reached out to me, it took us about 10 minutes. Because she said, you know, I would like to just talk to you. I've got some questions for you about what you posted. And when she called me, she said, I was one of your dad's students. I think was your dad. And then she described him and at the school. And I was like, yes, that's my dad. And she said, he's the worst teacher I ever had. I did something during like an assembly or something that embarrassed him. And from that point on, for the rest of the school year, he would purposefully target me and embarrass me in front of his class. She said he bullied me the rest of that school year. Wow. And I had to go to counseling in order to work through it because at that age, so my dad taught 5th grade, 6th grade. So yeah, usually 5th grade,
12 years old
11, 12-year-old that was getting bullied.
You don't have the capacity to manage
by my
that.
father in the classroom. And when she told me that, I was able to say, I am so sorry. I believe, she goes, is your dad really like that? And I was like, I'm sorry, but yeah. I mean, I can relate. That is what he does. If you agree with my dad's opinion, right, he's easy and great to get along with. As soon as you disagree with him, you become stupid, dangerous, and he targets you. And I remember growing up, my dad would say things about my aunts and uncles. They're just jealous of us. We don't want to hang out with them as often because they're dangerous. You know, oh, well, their kids are this, or, oh my gosh, our kids would never act that way. Like it was, he had to cut other people down to build himself up. Yeah. And that was a real big issue.
Yeah, we had a surgeon like that at Fort Leonard Wood, and he ended up getting fired for reasons related to this, but one of the another anesthetists there found out he was coming and was at a conference and talked to some people he knew, and they happened to know him too. And he's like, well, what is he like? And there's like, well, just don't tell him no. You'll probably be just fine, right? But once you told him no, and I experienced this firsthand, once you told him no, he was not on your side anymore. He was not reasonable. He was not willing to work through. And even for the good of the patient, like he was not able to focus on what the patient needed because you weren't doing it his way.
Right. Mason is the CRNA in this room. I can't stand Mason. Anything that goes wrong in here has to be Mason.
Right. Like we had one anesthetist that wore rings in the operating room. Well, as an anesthetist, that isn't an issue. And he took issue to it. And part of the reason he ended up getting fired over it because he was just unreasonable about it. And
right.
So, yeah. And yeah, see that in your dad as well. Just that, you know, the people that stay on his good side and probably would never even know that that's what's going on. But the people that stay on his good side or that he needs to have on his team, they're going to think he's great. And because he does have a lot of good qualities and he uses those to keep people on his team, right? Narcissists, for the most part, they're not dumb people. They know how to manipulate. They know how to...
They're socially smart. They're very street smart. Yes. Yeah, and some of them are incredibly intelligent as well, but I see some pretty low IQ
general,
and narcissists.
They know how to get what it is that they need to make themselves feel better. And so, yeah.
Well, and one of the things that I want to talk about, you know, so I now as a 41-year-old woman understand better the impact being raised by two parents on the personality disorder spectrum, and narcissism is a spectrum, just like autism. There's certain levels of severity and whatnot. And I would say that my dad is on the moderate to severe side. I have definitely seen cases way more severe than my father. One of the reasons Trump gets so much attention for it is he presents with very severe narcissistic personality disorder.
In his case, he's gotten to the point of power maybe where he doesn't have to, not have to play to the masses anymore, right?
Well, we can say that, but again, you want a leader in that position that empathizes and understands the people and that I don't give a shit about what anybody thinks. You know, a lot of people are like, oh, we really like that. And I'm like, ooh, I meant that's super dangerous.
He feels like that's kind of the case, right? Well, here I am. I don't need to play to the masses anymore. Let me just... say it what I think it is.
That's how he presents. There's no way to know if that's what he's actually thinking.
Absolutely not. Yeah.
Absolutely. So one of the other things that I want to put out there is as a victim of narcissistic abuse, starting in early childhood up until a year ago when I terminated all contact with my parents, I would say that in my 20s, I started to learn how to stand up for myself and speak out, but I did not do so to my father because it wasn't safe. It took until my mid-30s before I finally put my foot down and was like, enough is enough. And it took him targeting my child for that mama bear to override the fear of loss of love and acceptance, which I never really had that love and acceptance, not in a healthy way.
Not for a long time.
Not since 16. I was definitely loved and admired when I was itty bitty, but once I started thinking for myself as a teenager, that started to crumble. And then at 16, when I embarrassed him because I had premarital sex in the Mormon church, everything fell apart and I lost all of that. But I was constantly trying to win it back from him until he targeted my child.
Yeah.
And once
Don't mess with Mama Bear.
Yeah. Once he targeted my child, it was all downhill from there.
And we see that in abusive relationships too, right? Where a mom or a wife will take a lot of abuse, but then when you start to abuse the child, they're like, okay, never mind, I'm done. I can't tolerate that.
Yeah, we do see that quite a bit. But the reason I shared that is to kind of give those of you who are in these relationships and situations now, it takes time. Like undoing the psychological damage from being chronically manipulated and chronically having to play mind games in order to be loved, accepted, and safe. It takes its toll on us as humans.
Absolutely.
All right, so Mason.
We're not meant to do that.
No, we are not.
Have to put up with that kind of abuse for sure.
So Mason, you said that there were some symptoms that I had given you that we didn't talk about. What are you?
Oh, no. So the things that you said that are just tools that they use. Gaslighting, manipulation, I mentioned already. Passive aggressive.
Yeah, passive
nature,
aggressiveness.
which you kind of brought up in a couple of different things, and then just intimidation.
Yes.
So obviously not the 4 tools, but 4 tools that are commonly used by people in a narcissistic personality, commonly used by a lot of different people. So it's certainly not exclusive to narcissism. But,
right. Okay.
But again, one of the points that you had was, how do we protect ourselves in communication, which I assume that you're moving to here shortly. One of the ways that we're going to have to do that is to be able to recognize what kind of tools are being used so that we can plan and prepare for them.
All right. So, Mason, I actually want to turn the time over to you before we talk about the boundaries in communication and engaging with somebody who's struggling with narcissism. I want to know, what are some of the examples that you found in the LDS leadership regarding this topic?
Well, let me start by saying, when I was researching this, the first thing that I did was I just went back to Spotify and just scrolled through Mormonism Live. Mostly
because they've given a lot of source material.
Mostly because I feel like Bill Reel and RFM really do a good job of addressing material, using appropriate resources, and they're not just speaking off the cuff. They're not just making stuff up. They're using what they see and then backing it up with stuff that's helpful. So the first thing I did was I just went through that.
I just want to say I totally agree with that. I feel that Bill Reel and RFM do a good job of presenting the information and the source material. And while they do express their opinions
and strongly sometimes
sometimes, I love that they give that source material so that you can go in, find what they're talking about, and formulate your own opinion based on your own research.
I feel like in a lot of ways they're doing similar to what we're doing. They find a topic that is of interest to people and they discuss it. We discuss it in a little bit different way. And so I don't want to, and we mentioned this, I think, in the first
we're
episode.
not recreating what
We're
they
not
do.
trying to recreate what they do. And so a lot of this, if you need some information or would like to expose yourself more to this, then going to Mormonism Live might be helpful. And I'll put a few episodes in the notes that were helpful to me on these kind of topics. But so as I went through that and I just wrote down a few episodes, just some examples here. So you actually you mentioned this one when we were doing our stuff planning, but not in the actual episode here.
You mean last night when we were braiding Abby's hair? I mentioned it. Oh, okay.
Yeah, in our planning meeting, this came up, and it's been a big deal for me.
Squirrel, we put rainbow braids in Abby's hair. She's cousin to a unicorn. That's what she told me. She goes, I have rainbow hair because my cousin is a unicorn. And I just went,
nice.
Okay,
Very
y'all.
nice.
Rainbow unicorn hair.
So one of the things that came up, and I think we've kind of addressed in some of the episodes that we've done, is their inability to apologize.
Yes.
And so that did not come up in this episode. I want to call attention to that because it's one of the things that is most triggering for me personally, and I'm certain that's the case for lots of other people too. But one of the examples that I have there is, first off, we have the quote from Elder Oaks who says the church doesn't seek apologies and we don't give them. And I just find that very disingenuous, especially for a church that preaches over and over again repentance.
Yeah.
Like in the Book of Mormon, when Jesus comes and visits the people there, he says, this is my gospel. My gospel is that I came to do the will of my Father and that all the world needs to repent.
Right.
Repentance comes with an apology. It's one of the steps. You have to show remorse and fix it. It has to be, you have to apologize for it. And so...
Right, but I want to bring that back to, diagnostic criteria number 3, the belief that they are special or unique.
Sure.
And then number 7, that the lack of empathy, the unwillingness to identify how the action has affected others. My opinion, the way that I see this lack of apologizing is, well, it came from God, so we're just going to do some God blaming. It's God's fault that the blacks had to suffer that long. It's God's fault that the suicide rates went up in the LGBTQ population. My heart really goes out to you, but you're going to have to take this one up with God because God says.
Right.
And so God ends up becoming the scapegoat scapegoat in the Mormon religion quite a bit.
Yeah.
And he's used as the scapegoat, in my opinion, for the flaws of the prophets, for the racism of the prophets. And so it's really difficult for, again, if we apologize, then we're admitting that our prophets were wrong, and heaven forbid the prophets be wrong, therefore, and we're not going to pay attention to how healing and effective apology and specific, not, we understand how much this hurt all of you, but hey, y'all, we agree. We don't understand where it came from. We don't understand what they were thinking, but this definitely does not appear to be from God. And we want to talk about, how important it is to be able to question your leaders. But then again, that comes right back into that narcissistic tendency, is that they expect, where is it? Number 5, automatic compliance with his or her expectations. And I feel like the Mormon church is very guilty of that. The prophet said it, you just do it, and you don't ask any questions. I see that a lot in word of wisdom stuff. Like, your mom was drinking green tea for a lot of years, and when Nelson said even green tea was against the word of wisdom, she stopped despite multiple health benefits that she had experienced in drinking green tea.
Right.
It was that automatic compliance. And then just to kind of spread that out, we kind of get these narcissistic tendencies going on for people, for parents, when it's, I expect my children to be automatically compliant. Like, that's a narcissistic trait. We've got to be able to communicate and understand where people are coming from.
One of the unhealthy things that is translated from the way the church does things into our personal and daily lives, I certainly struggle with that. I struggle with when my kids aren't compliant right away. I take it personally. We talked about this,
I think, grumpy
on a previous podcast, and I struggle with that. And I think it's partly because of the idea, well, I'm right. So if I'm right, why should I have to fight them on doing this? Just do it.
Well,
I don't think that's healthy.
I think a lot of it is the belief of I'm right, therefore nothing else matters.
Yes.
And the means justify the end, or whatever.
The ends justify the means, yeah.
The ends justify the means, and well, you're going to struggle with relationships with your kiddos.
It plays to this idea of a lack of empathy, right? If I'm right and nothing else matters, you're not allowing yourself to be with this person who is struggling with whatever it is, and for whatever reason.
You're not allowing them to be human and have human responses. Absolutely.
So the first one was the no apology, and I wanted to bring that out simply because it had not been addressed yet. There was another one that I wrote down in I think it's 18... Oh, shoot, I'm going to get this wrong. I think it was 1887. John Taylor was still the president of the church, and he said what he claimed was a revelation, that polygamy was never going away, ever. This was a doctrine to last through the eternities. And then, of course, just 3 years later, Wilford Woodruff became the president and gave the manifesto, the declaration saying that the polygamy is going to stop. And there's a lot of issues with that manifesto, too. I actually read through a little bit of it just today, and I'm like, well, yeah, there's some issues here. But anyway, just the idea that the church can't seem to address those kind of things. They have no clear answer to why this happens. And so they just... anyway, so
right, it's we fixed it, move on. This is how it is now. This is how it was yesterday. Deal with it. This is how it is now. Deal with it. But if you leave us, you're going to hell. And
I think that's because they have no clear answer to explain it, to really get with people and say. And maybe that's why when you talk about the church as kind of a narcissistic organization, the organization and the leadership in the organization seems unwilling or unable to actually sit with people when it's a policy or a doctrinal thing. We've changed this, like you said, the blacks and the priests are right. Policy's different. Why are we still talking about this?
Right.
That's not an empathetic way to deal with it.
Well, and I think it's important to recognize, so yes, I would absolutely say with certainty that the LDS church is a narcissistic system. I think that many of the people are wonderful and good.
Sure.
and amazing people. But one of the
some of the best people I've ever met, right? Yeah.
Right. But also if we look at all of the people that you've met over the course of your lifetime, the church has definitely influenced the people that you've met.
Sure.
Just it's still limited, very limited view there. But sorry, squirrel. So coming right back to the narcissism thing, though, is that one of the things that we see coming out of these high demand cult-like religions. I would say that the LDS Church fits the diagnostic criteria for a cult, even though that's not something that most Mormons want to hear at all. But speaking under the Steve Hassan's model of what constitutes a cult, the church absolutely fits that. But one of the things that we see coming out of these systems is a much higher prevalence for personality disorders in general, especially cluster B personalities, which are really the personalities that are maladaptive and dramatic in relationships. Now, having said that, if you're dealing with somebody with OCD, personality disorder, or avoidance personality disorder, I mean, there's a lot of difficulty in that as well, or dependent personality disorder. The cluster A is more of your paranoid and schizophrenia spectrum personality disorders. But those cluster B personality disorders are very prevalent in these high demand communities. And I think a lot of the reason is because there's a lot of trauma going on. You're not allowed to talk about it. You're usually emotionally stunted in your emotional development, because if you just do what you're told, everything will be okay, and that really stops you. And we're actually going to have Wendy Wilcox Jensen on in the near future, and she and I and you, Mason, we're going to talk about the emotional immaturity of individuals in these high demand systems and why that is and where it comes from and what causes a lot of that. But because of all of these things, we see people coming out of these systems who really struggle with extreme emotional responses to seemingly small stimuli because they have not been given the opportunity to develop appropriately. So if you're coming out of a narcissistic system, it makes sense that you are traumatized because of the mind games and the lack of empathy and the lack of safety shown. Like, one of the reasons the LDS Church might feel so safe is because it's a very black and white, rule-based, highly structured system that if you stay in line with the system, everything works for you. But as soon as you start to test those boundaries, the response is really toxic. It makes sense that we've got a lot of personality disorders coming out of these types of systems.
Yeah, there's a brother who bore his testimony today in church and talked about how simple the gospel was, and the older he gets, the more simple it gets. And my thought was, for you that works, but usually that simplicity is because you're ignoring a whole lot of cacophony, and he's chosen to do that. The system works for him. Okay, fine, right? Like, I don't begrudge you doing that, but a lot is getting ignored, and so that's the first one, is just that recognizing no apology, and the next one. So I just have two others because I just kind of looked at the things that you that you did. The second one is the very first thing you talked about was the unreasonable sense of their high importance, and the first thing that came up that you and I addressed was culture robbing.
Yeah.
The idea that because the church as a system, and this is not exclusive at all to Mormonism, it certainly is a Christianity thing. It's a Muslim thing, right? You think that your culture, your organization is the best, and you actively seek to suppress or rid your organization of other types of culture.
Because we're right, because we're better, because we're holier, because we have the answers and you don't, and you're suffering. Yeah.
Right. So that's a big one for me, just recognizing that that's what's going on.
I want to dig into that a little bit. So we have this, historically speaking, multiple religions have done this. However, in our modern day, I don't think we see it as much, at least not in the United States. I think that there's been some, pullback on that. and maybe I'm wrong, but things like, we'll say back in the old days, the Native American program where we were adopting people out of native homes or from South America and robbing them of their culture is one illustration of that. But I actually had a conversation with your aunt who was serving in their mission in Africa. And one of the things I brought up was, what right do you have to go tell them that the way they're living their life is wrong and that yours is better? Like, you are robbing them. You are going in to erase their culture so that they conform to what you believe is the prescribed right thing to do without any, like, what do you know about their culture? Have you been there? Have you learned to embrace and value the way they view and interface with the world? You're going in not knowing hardly anything about their culture, their people, their trials, their struggles, and expecting them to allow you to bring, you're going in with, we're a missionary, our ways are better than your ways, join us, and then you leave them. Like, you go in, you erase their culture, and then you leave them. Like, you give them this huge shift that they're supposed to just accept, and then you walk away, and they have to figure it out on their own. It's disgusting. Well, it is disgusting to me.
Whether or not they walk away, I think is a debatable thing, but certainly there is there is what feels like a very great lack of empathy or understanding of their culture. They don't come in to go, well, let's get to know you. Let's get to know your culture, why these things work for you, how these things work for you.
Right.
Okay, well, now that I understand that, what about this?
Well, and we don't go in with, now that I understand it, how can Mormonism enhance it? Is there something you could take away that would make your celebration of your culture better? No, it's you join our church and there's an expectation that you conform to our way of worship, our way of viewing things. And now you're under the rule of this prophet and his word is law. Right. And you obey it without question, without criticism. It's culture erasure for sure.
Right. Well, and they like to say, come and we'll add to your stuff, and so they like to say that, but that's just, it's not really the case.
I'm looking at our timestamp. I think we're going to go over a little bit today. All right. And then the last one really is a big one here. I think we've talked about this before. There's the interview with M. Russell Ballard and Dallin H. Oaks, where M. Russell Ballard talks about people are complaining that the church is hiding stuff or has been hiding stuff. And he goes into this kind of a diatribe that would never happen, basically. And I want to read this response. There's a response in the Tribune. I want to read the response because of the way that it talks about this. But anyway, he says, as two apostles who have traveled the world, who have seen a lot, we'd have to say that there's no attempt on the church ever to hide anything. And just... I'm sorry.
Well, and whatever...
The internet really fucked that up for them, didn't it?
Well, and whatever your belief on that, it's just... anyway, let me just read what the response here. So the writer says this quote, and I'll have the reference to this article in here. This quote shows the narcissistic gaslighting tactics routinely employed by the leaders of the Mormon Church. After 1, citing their credentials, 2, asserting their dominance, and I'm adding the numbers just because of the commas, citing their credentials, asserting their dominance, and 3, shaming the audience for questioning. 4, a bold claim that rejects the skeptical mindset is made. The audience is subsequently directed to simply trust, quote unquote, those in authority. Such rhetoric is invalidating, discourages exploration and free thought, completely lacks even a shred of empathy, and is thus abusive to active, struggling, and former Mormons alike. And I absolutely loved this quote because
Salt Lake Tribune,
right? Because they addressed it from a standpoint of this is what is going on. Look at the quote. Everything that they just said validated by what was said by Dallin H. Oaks and M. Russell Ballard. Feel about them however you want. if you can look at it and look at their quote and then look at this quote from the Tribune, you can see that they are not overstating the issue. And I think that the way that I added this in, it probably fits in other things, but I put it in number 5, the sense of entitlement, the lying, the ends justify the means. Because the church is true, we can do these kind of things in order to quote unquote protect the church, but they're not protecting the members.
Well, and one of the things that's really interesting is they say we didn't lie. And now they're saying, look, this has always been this way.
Right.
And now they're making us question, well, that information's always been available. You just didn't do your research to learn it. Yeah. This is a prime example of the gaslighting. And for those who are members who are like, what are they talking about? Something as simple as the Book of Mormon being translated via gold plates on a table with a sheet in between people versus the rock and the hat. Like, I didn't hear about the rock and the hat version of stuff until I was in my late 30s. And I've been a member my entire life. Like the pictures that they used in Family Home Evening, the pictures that were used in primary lessons, the pictures on the wall. Nobody had a picture of Joseph Smith's face buried in a hat and somebody scribing for him at all. You know, things like that, like the very foundation of where the stories come from. We're not even getting into how many wives Joseph Smith had and if they were spiritual or actual wives. We're talking about the core narrative of how the church came to be has changed.
Right. Well, and again, the whole point of gaslighting is to turn the onus onto you. This isn't our problem. This is your problem.
So that you question your own reality or so that you diminish how much it bothers somebody else. Like how many times have I now shared that story with somebody and they've been like, you know, I really don't think how the Book of Mormon came to be is all that important. It's here and it's the Word of God. And I know that because I prayed about it and I feel good about it. And I'm going, wow, you just glanced over the fact that you have been lied to. If I told you a lie and you found out that I had lied to you, if that doesn't impair our relationship on some front, there's an issue here.
Right.
But the fact that the church is able to get away with the lying with very little pushback from the active members, with very little accountability at all, that's a victim responding to an abuser. If I had told my dad when I was 16, you're lying, that's not how it goes, or you're abusing me right now, you shouldn't be slapping me, you shouldn't be doing this, I couldn't have done that then. It wasn't safe for me.
You'd gotten more abused.
My voice was always invalidated, and I would have been bullied and more abused. Yeah. And that's what we see coming out of the church. Like the church, the system, the leaders in saying these things are very much acting in a way that I would consider abusive. I agree with the Salt Lake Tribune that it's abusive, and it's coming from the leaders, and it is, I agree, very narcissistic.
Yeah. Yeah. So those are the things that I wrote down. There's actually one other thing I'd like to share. I was sitting in, it's Sunday for us, sitting in Sunday school today, listening, and I love the teacher there. He actually does a very good job of teaching, but I leaned over to a friend of mine who was sitting next to me, and I was like, yeah, they don't want my answer. And I said that to him, and he's like, well, what is your answer? I was like, I don't think you want my answer either. And so then I pulled up my phone and I wrote it down. And I just want to kind of read because I struggle being vulnerable and being specific and being sharing what's really inside of me. You know, what we've shared today details things that I'm a little passionate about. Probably you can tell from the volume.
Yeah, I can see your sound waves over here. Like,
anyway,
right now you're middle of the range, but a few minutes ago you were all over the place. That was awesome. There's going to be some red in the rendering today.
We're talking about Christmas and, you know, spreading the light of Christ, and the world needs your light, and blah blah blah. But I wrote this down because they asked, you know, what about the light of Christ? Okay. You know, how does the light of Christ affect you or benefit you in your life? And this is what I wrote. I said, I think the idea of the light of Christ. Well, and let me just clarify. In the Book of Mormon, it talks about everyone on the earth is blessed with the light of Christ. This kind of almost like a conscience kind of a thing. But anyway,
your
everyone's blessed with it.
Your
everybody
goodness,
has it.
Everybody has it. Yep.
Okay. And basically they say, everything that's good in the world or inspires you to be good comes from the light of Christ, and everything that does the opposite comes from Satan. So I think the idea, this is me again, I think the idea of the light of Christ makes everything we do that is good in our life because of him. He owns the good in us. I don't get to own any of my goodness. Everything comes from the light of Christ. Everything that we do is bad is either my fault internally, the natural man, quote unquote, or my fault for yielding to the temptation of the devil. I get to own all the evil. This creates a significant power differential that seems impossible to overcome. We are thus not brothers of Christ, but owned by him. And that is verified in Scripture that talks about Jesus Christ owning us. You cannot have a healthy relationship with someone when you are always on uneven ground. Not owning any of my goodness keeps me subjugated to God as opposed to seeking God in my life. And I know that that's not how everybody sees it, and that's okay. But I just wanted to share the idea that something as simple as the light of Christ, which is supposed to be a positive thing in our lives, if we actually sit down, it may be having some significant negative impacts in our lives. We talked about, people in high-demand religions struggling with toxic perfectionism and things like that. So I just kind of wanted to share my thought there. There's other things that I wrote down, but they're not quite as involved. So I just wanted to share that.
Number one, I love your answer, and I'm freaking proud of you. Demonstrates a great deal of emotional growth and some critical thinking. If you are owned by somebody, they are your master, you are their slave. It is a huge power differential. And I agree with you. You cannot have a meaningful relationship with somebody when you're not on the level playing field. And, like for our children and we're their parents, the uneven playing field is a temporary state. And then that playing field is supposed to even. Yeah. I think a lot of times religion says, the playing field is uneven in this life, but it'll even up in the next. But that doesn't seem to be what is actually taught.
That's not doctrine. Yeah.
Even in the next life, that playing field is never equal. So I love that. The second thing I want to say, and then I'll let you go. I'll let you interrupt me again. I'm not letting you interrupt me. My boundaries here. Is you're correct. I don't think either of those people would have wanted to hear that answer. Right.
Well, the friend actually read it. And he said, I think this is a decent answer. And I think you could have said this in the meeting. And I said, I don't think so. And we talked about that. But my caveat is, like a parent, when I have my best interactions with my kids, especially when they're little, I bend down.
You get on their level.
I get face to face with them.
Eyeball to eyeball.
And some of the power differential is, of course, still there, right? I can't get rid of the power differential, but I can sort of put myself on their level in order to even the playing field. And I believe that God does that. I believe that Jesus does that they get on our level and they're with us on our level. And that's very important in establishing a relationship with them, which I think is very important. But not recognizing that there is always a power differential and that some of the choices we make are based on that or affected by that. If we don't recognize that that's there, we're missing out on a piece of something that could be having a huge impact on our lives and we don't understand.
Yeah, absolutely. So when it comes to recognizing boundaries in communication with individuals who have a narcissistic way of speaking, number one, or a narcissistic personality, number one, confrontation is going to get you in trouble. Straight up confrontation is going to be met with, something we call the backfire effect, but with a lot more intense digging in, a lot more intense role reversal, blaming, turning the tables, abuse, more intense gaslighting, more intense sabotaging your relationships with others. And so what the recommendation is to come into the relationship kind of in this like sideways manner, which is, utilizing those I feel statements quite a bit. but also recognizing that any type of communication with somebody who is not willing or able to empathize with you or take accountability for their actions, that you need to be in a place where you can identify whether or not continuing in the relationship is in your best interest or your children's best interest or the people around you's best interest. Because narcissists do not have the ability or the willingness to be vulnerable. And when there is an inability to be vulnerable in a relationship, and when there is a lack of empathetic understanding, and one of the things in the DSM that it talks about is that narcissists are really good at cognitive empathy, which is basically an intellectual understanding. So yes, I understand that me kicking you in the shins hurt your feelings or made you mad, but that they don't know how to really get into that emotional place with you. And there's not that effort going in, that oftentimes the best thing to do is to break ties with that individual. If you're in a marriage with a narcissistic person, here I am like giving that label, but with somebody whose narcissistic tendencies are very toxic to the relationship and you've decided to end the relationship, you need to hire an attorney that is familiar with fighting narcissists. I have seen a lot of narcissistic individuals get a lot of really horrible rulings for their family members in court because usually narcissists are not willing to lose. They don't lose with grace. So it's not about dividing assets and making custody arrangements that are healthy for everybody. It's about winning a war. And if you're engaging in a legal battle with somebody who is out for blood, who is out to win a war and not come to an agreement that is in the best interest of all the parties, it's going to get ugly. You need an attorney on your side who is familiar with narcissism in relationships. It's going to be very, very vital to you. Mason, your hand is like starting to go up. Did you have anything you wanted to say? You're just Mason's over there nodding his head like crazy.
Sorry. I just had a thing that popped up. You said you need an attorney that's familiar with narcissism. I was like, that shouldn't be too hard. I know a lot of narcissistic attorneys.
Oh my God. You know what?
And that's not fair to say, but
no, it's not.
It was funny, yeah. So.
No, but there are, I mean, yes, there's a lot of really nasty.
We watched Philadelphia the other day, right? And
yes.
Somebody tells the joke about, he says, what do you call 1,000 attorneys at the bottom of the ocean? And he's like, a good start. And it's just like... Just that idea. It's like, it's great. Not fair. It's just the jokes that people tell. So.
Right. One of the other benefits when you're in these types of relationships is to find a support group. Find some people around you that you can check your reality with. I have a friend of mine, a very close friend of mine, who divorced somebody who was formally diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder. And one of the things that this individual would do is she would say, I need to check my reality. Did this just happen? Like, this is what I'm thinking. Does that make sense? Does my line of thinking work out here? Having people around you able to be honest with you about whether or not your thinking makes sense and is logical and is reality-based can be really, really helpful when you're in a narcissistic relationship. Because again, remember that gaslighting and that mind game and those manipulations are meant to make you question your own reality. And so having some friends that you can double check your reality with is important. It's also pretty normal for narcissists to isolate you. So if you're being socially isolated, that's a problem. And you need to have people, you need to find a way out of that. And if you're really, really stuck, you can call 911 and police can come and get you to a domestic violence shelter for sure. Mason, did you have anything you wanted to add to that? About support groups?
Yeah, it's a sensitive topic. And if you're in that situation, having people there to take care of you and to help combat the gaslighting and all the different tools that they use to keep you isolated, those are going to be maybe the most important things to get you out of that situation. So certainly seek for support. And
And the last one is practice good self-care. If you are engaged in a relationship where there are lots of narcissistic characteristics or tendencies in your partner, it's going to be very important for you to make sure that you take breaks, you get self-care, and that you are able to, what's the word I'm looking for? Recover, to take purposeful times to separate yourself from the situation and recover. And so there's going to be things that I would say you want to do every day, and things that you're going to want to do every week, and things you're going to want to do, on a monthly basis, on a quarterly basis, on an annual basis. But make sure you are filling your life with healthy, positive supports as you work through these things. Again, there are many individuals who have overcome narcissistic tendencies. It's hard, it takes a lot of effort, but it's not the norm. There are many people who are successful in it. Unfortunately, one of the challenges with narcissism is that the people thrive in the dysfunction. The dysfunction feeds the disorder, and we see that in those cluster B personality disorders, is that it's almost like those individuals are addicted to that level of dysfunction, and so having people come out of that can be very difficult. There's a lot of really good therapeutic interventions for people on the narcissistic personality spectrum. However, that individual has to be in a place where they are ready and willing to admit where they're wrong and learn how to improve their empathy skills through some very intensive empathy training. So thanks again for joining us. We would love to hear from our listeners. We would love to have y'all email us at daisygirlcommunications@gmail.com. You can also find my contact information on our website, which is daisygirlcommunications.com. Did I just say that right? daisygirlcommunications@gmail.com is the email. daisygirlcommunications.com is the website. You can contact me either way. But we would love to hear about your experiences and your thoughts on the LDS leadership. And we're talking about those, we'll say anybody that is considered a general authority or a high position of local leadership, and some of the experiences or thoughts you have on, is the prophet a narcissist, or are the leaders of the church narcissistic? We would love to hear what you have to say, and we will do a follow-up episode and answer any questions that you send to us.
Yeah, we didn't address that topic specifically.
Yeah.
I think we addressed it pretty well, though.
Yeah, well, because we didn't talk about I've got like four instances with Nelson that makes me go, oh, I really think he might actually qualify for the diagnostic. I think that diagnosis of narcissistic personality disorder, there are four things that we didn't even cover those. So we will be doing a follow-up episode. We want to see what y'all come up with. What, Mason, were you going to say? And then I was
going to say, I think there was an episode of Mormonism Live that kind of addresses that, but they don't come from the psychological standpoint.
No, they did. So Mormonism Live did an episode on gaslighting.
Yeah, but I mean specific to Russell M. Nelson, and so they kind of sort of comes up, but doesn't really, because of course they're not qualified to make that call.
So, well, neither am I, because I do not have him as a patient.
Right.
But we would love to hear from you, so please send us your stories. And when we do our follow-up episode, we'll take a couple of those emails and maybe even invite you to come on the show with us. Thanks so much. See you next time. Unpacking Mormonism and Other Religious Trauma is hosted by me, Sarah Westbrook, and my husband, Mason Westbrook. Produced by Daisy Girl Communications and Alex Vidalis. Our music today was Moving Forward by Run to Life. Right. I just have a side question for you real quick.
Uh-oh.
How many times have you solved the Rubik's Cube since we've been sitting here?
I think it's just twice.
Just
so
twice.
I've messed it up again now for the third time.
Okay. So y'all, Mason can do the Rubik's Cube. And that's his fidget toy over there. When I'm rambling on and he's trying to stay engaged but not talking much, he's fidgeting.